Hello, everyone, and welcome back to this week's episode of the Rosen Rubini podcast, Making Sense of This World. My name is Manas Chavla, and for once in person, I am really pleased to be joined by CEO and Head of Research, Brunello Rosa. Brunello, this is our sort of once a year in-person edition.
Yes, exactly.
Predictably, this week we're talking about Donald Trump, but specifically Trump's Liz Truss moment as he backs down on tariffs. I mean, it really seemed for a while like Donald Trump was sticking to his guns about these tariffs, the exemptions, and the turnaround came, at least a few days after it has previously. Give us some of the background on all this. How did this unfold?
Yeah, so we had, of course, Liberation Day, the 2nd of April. And we actually said that, these big movements, the beginning of globalization, the end of globalization, they tend to be processes. You can never pin down a day in which they begin, a day in which they end, and so this time around, we are quite lucky. We know the day in which this phase of globalization really ended, and that was 2nd of April. This is when the US has alerted the world that they didn't think that globalization was working for them. They thought that actually they were a victim of globalization. The only winners were China and all the other countries. They were cheating, on the US and effectively, exploiting whatever the US consumer, US market, you name it. Clearly, the market totally unraveled because this is not just a small blip, it's massive sea change in policymaking in the direction of travel of the major global economy. So the situation got really bad. Markets went belly up. The equity market collapsed. The treasury market also, and the dollar. So you have both the dollar and the treasury selling off at the same time, which is a very unusual movement. This really scared Scott Bessent, and at that time also Latnick, the Secretary of Commerce. So they both went to Donald Trump and said, look, you really need to make a U-turn, which occurred, right? So you had one of the most spectacular U-turn in recent policy making, in the sense that was the guy said, well, I would never consider that. And then it starts the story of 90-day moratorium, then the exemption to phones, then electronics, other consumer goods. So, try to minimize the damage. And the market, to some extent, has responded. However, here the biggest problem is that the US administration really need to put his act together and see whether this set of policies is consistent with remaining the reference country in the global economy, or whether a new phase is about to begin.
Yeah. It seems like, and this is something you alluded to, that we live in an era of a sort of self-justified American exceptionalism, which is personified by Donald Trump himself. And we heard something about these, badges, these pins that people are wearing around the White House. Tell me more about that and what that tells you about his leadership style.
So it seems like the US is entering an era of the cult of personality or leaders, in a sense that it's not a question anymore of thinking with your head, but like fideistically believing in whatever is you're told from the leader maximum. And it becomes unquestionable. Whatever he says must be right. And you hear all these minions, let me call it that way, of the administration say, I trust the process, I trust the president, I trust this, I trust this. And guess what? They are the only ones who actually trust. Because clearly other people don't. Other policymakers don't, the market doesn't. And here is when it really got, to some extent, interesting, in a sense that when you are characterized by this cult of personality, you think to be invincible. You think you can bully everybody, everything, institutions, parties, political leaders, countries. You think you can do whatever you want. until you realize that you can't. You find the limit, and this limit is represented by the market. Now, because the market is way bigger than everybody at this point, and is actually to some extent uncontrollable. This has always been true for some, first of all, for all emerging markets, but also for some developed markets that are considered to be more fragile. In Italy, which, as you know, have been under market scrutiny, the scrutiny of the so-called bond vigilantes for ages now, they call it the dictatorship of the spread, right? In the sense that there's always, the fear of doing something wrong, which means that then the market explodes and you don't know how to bring it back to where it was. And therefore, the various facilities the ECB had to invent, the OMT, and more recently the TPI and all the rest, just to make sure that if something goes wrong, the central bank can always intervene and keep market well behaved. So for the first time, the US experienced market discipline. And so that's why we call it the Liz Truss moment, because this is reminiscent of what happened a couple of years prior to Liz Truss.
Yeah. Let's talk more about how it was sort of that Liz Truss moment and what exactly the parallel is, between these two situations, because it ended quite disastrously for Liz Truss. I wonder how this will go for Donald Trump.
Yeah, well, Liz Truss was, as you know, the shortest serving prime minister in the UK, only lasted 54 days. Somehow it was predicted, but maybe not as short. She came out with a mini budget, which effectively was comprised of a lot of unfunded tax cuts that the market didn't believe. She thought this was the way of implementing this pipe dream of Brexit being a sort of transforming the UK in a sort of Singapore on Thames, which we always thought it was impossible because you have such a huge security and safety net that you need to have a different social contract than simply, I cut your taxes and, good luck with it. That's more an American approach. So Liz Truss faced immediately market pressure. There was a massive sell-off in yields, which of course is much smaller and much less liquid bond market compared to the treasuries. So within a couple of days of this intensive sell-off, also the pound, so same story, lack of confidence in both the bonds and the currency, the central bank had to step in because some of the most relevant trades that were going on in the UK, the so-called LDIs, which means liability-driven investments, which are those investments that are made by pension funds, were unraveling. It effectively is a story of pension funds trying to match the liabilities that they have there longer term. So they try to match the maturity, but you don't have such long-term bonds beyond the 50-year bond, which is, when you look duration-wise, since there's a coupon, is actually shorter. So pension funds needs to find other ways of lengthening the maturity of their assets to match their liabilities. So this is the liability-driven investment, which is huge. And the unraveling of this trade meant that these pension funds could literally go belly up within a week. The Bank of England had to step in, buying these government bonds, making sure that they would remain at a decent yield. But then Andrew Bailey said, guys, I'm going to buy for 3 or 4 days. I calm the market, so there's no reason to panic anymore. But you need to find a solution. On Monday, I'm not going to renew the facility, okay? Which was a very strong signal to Liz Truss. Look, either you change tack or you will change tack. So there was no much option. Months later, almost a year later, Liz Truss said that she actually thought about firing Andrew Bailey during that weekend. Thank God she didn't do. But then on Monday, she had to face the inevitable, which was resignation. So she resigned, and then eventually Rishi Sunak came on board. He was her contender during the Tory leadership contest, but especially he was the former Chancellor of the Exchequer under Boris Johnson, as we know, and therefore it was considered to be a relatively safer, or if not real safe, pair of hands. So Liz Truss was gone, Rishi Sunak came in. So I think that's the story there.
Yeah. And in the United States, the situation seems to be somewhat similar. How has Fed Chair Powell handled it compared to Andrew Bailey?
Well, the parallel there is that in the UK you had the LDIs, in the US you had the basis trade, which is a fundamental trade in finance that closes the arbitrage opportunity between cash bonds and futures. Here at the LSE, where we both are, we teach this, regularly to our students. When you close a futures and it needs to be delivered, there's always a small discrepancy with the cash bond. So the yield of the cash bond is not much, 2-3 basis points, enough for a leverage trade to be made and be very profitable. And this is a case in which speculation is actually stabilizing rather than destabilizing, because they close arbitrage opportunities. Okay, so shaking the system to a point in which even that fundamental arbitrage condition is in danger really meant that you really have shaken the tree from the deepest roots. Okay, this is something that should never ever come in question. And so eventually, so clearly the idea was for Trump to force the hand of Powell to do something similar, either start buying bonds or cutting rates, so more or less having the same effects. But in this case, Powell didn't intervene. Also because he knew, or he hoped, that pressure coming from other parts would eventually convince Trump to back down. And actually, having him feeling a bit of the market pressure was a good move. The other thing is, Trump may see this as a lack of respect, an attack on him. You call it as you want. In reality, he really saved the president's back, because in a moment in which confidence in US institutions was vanishing, the White House was at the center of this disaster. The Treasury was perceived to be very timid in all this, and definitely taken over by the policies of Lutnick or the Department of Commerce. So all this was really shaking investors' confidence in the institution. So the only one standing was the Fed. So the idea that the Fed would not act on the pressure of the president was actually a very good thing that the Fed did, not just for itself and for the system, but also for the president, because it gave him a chance not to govern, effectively a very, very messy situation the day after, if they had done that.
Well, what's the difference with the case of the UK? You make an analogy to Italy in the newsletter. Tell us about that.
Yeah, I mean, there have been a few examples, as I was saying. Some undisputable, or let's put it this way, some unsuspected countries can feel the market pressure. So we talk about emerging markets, that's kind of known. Some important developed markets, such as Italy, but it's always been considered a bit fragile. But even some of the most developed of the developed countries, such as UK, a global financial center with some of the largest banks in the world and all the rest of it, faced the pressure of the market. So when this happens, the situation was that in 2011, Berlusconi had to resign, even if he had a massive majority. In 2022, Liz Truss had to resign, even if she enjoyed a large majority. So the question was, is there a mechanism in the US for Trump to be resigned, be retired by somebody else? Can somebody tell the president, sorry, you need to go, as it happened for Berlusconi in 2011 and for Liz Truss in 2022? No, there isn't such a mechanism in the US Constitution. And this is the reason why the market is still so scared, because the culprits, so to speak, and the people responsible for this disaster are still there, still steering policies, still making decisions. So restoring confidence in this case is extremely hard. And so I think the best thing that everybody can do at this stage is just holding tight and hope that if other of these shocks occur, the system remain resilient and show that, you know, the only way forward is for a much more mainstream policy making to be adopted.
Yeah. I mean, so much volatility, and it's sort of hardly even been 3 months Donald Trump in office. But it's good to do a characteristically Brunello piece, something that brings in Liz Truss, Trump, and Berlusconi in the same article. Something we'll continue to watch for the next few weeks. But as always, thank you so much for your time and insight.
Thank you very much. Till next time.